Good morning. Welcome to Authors at Google in Cambridge. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Ha-Joon Chang, author of Economics, the User's Guide. In his best-selling 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, Dr. Chang, the Cambridge economist, brilliantly debunked many of the predominant myths of neoclassical economics. Now, in an entertaining and accessible primer, he explains how the global economy actually works in real-world terms. Writing with irreverent wit, a deep knowledge of history, and a disregard for conventional economic pieties, he offers insights that will never be found in the textbooks. Dr. Chang teaches in the Faculty of Economics at Cambridge University. His books include the international bestseller Bad Samaritans, The Myth of Free Trade and the Secret History of Capitalism, Kicking Away the Ladder, winner of the 2003 Myrdal Prize, and again, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. In 2005, he was awarded the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ha-Joon Chang.
Good morning. My great pleasure to be here. As a recent recruit to your Android system, I thank you for inventing a very good one. I come from the other Cambridge, which is a few hundred years older than here. But then there are places like Oxford where there's a college called New College, which was founded in the 15th century. So we are a lot more advanced than that. Today I want to talk about this book, Economics, the User's Guide. And the reason why I got to write this book is, many people agree that economics is very important. Economic events like 2008 financial crisis or the rise of China, invention of the internet and so on. They seriously affect our lives for better or worse, and how our business and political leaders deal with those changes also affect how people live, how they grow old, how they retire, and so on. So everyone agrees that economic issues are very important, but when it comes to talking about those things, when it comes to talking about economics, which is supposed to tell you how these things do work and should work, there's widespread perception that it is too complicated. Economics is too complicated for non-specialists. Actually, it's very interesting because we have very strong opinions about all sorts of things. Iraq war, gay marriage, Afghanistan, climate change, nuclear power. I have strong views on all those things. But then are we actually qualified to make those judgments? That the only thing I know about international politics is this introduction to international relations that I took as an undergraduate student back in South Korea in 1983. And then I'm saying all kinds of things about U.S. foreign policy and the Middle East and the role of Britain in that. And so we are not actually afraid of saying those things without having the necessary qualifications. Well, when it comes to economics, people say, that's too difficult. It's for the experts. And indeed, the experts themselves say, yes, this stuff is so difficult, you wouldn't understand it even if we try to explain it to you. So don't worry. Everything's under control. Go away. Don't look into this. But why? Why should economics be different? It's only because that my professional colleagues have been fantastically successful in convincing the rest of the world that the stuff is so difficult that it's not going to be understandable to mere mortals. But I believe, as I said in my earlier book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, I believe that 95% of economics is actually common sense. of course, are made to look difficult with the use of mathematics and graphs and jargons. And even the remaining 5%, I would argue, can be understood in their essence, if not in all technical details, if somebody bothers to explain them in an accessible way, which is what I try to do in this book. Yeah, so I, tried my best to make it interesting. So there is Mary Poppins, The Simpsons, well, at least Ned Flanders, my favorite Simpsons character, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Matrix, My Fair Lady, Gone with the Wind, and whatnot. Huh? However, being accessible doesn't mean that I'm trying to give you some kind of baby version or dummy's version of economics to you. Yeah? So only remember these 15 things, 7 things you need to know about inflation or that kind of approach. Yeah? I take my readers very seriously and talk about all kinds of fundamental things. So what is economics? We can talk about that, but I don't think we have enough time to do that. Whether economics can be a science, as some or indeed many economists claim, the ethical foundations of economics, whether we can separate economics from politics, different approaches to understanding the economy and so on. So if I briefly, this is the cover of the British edition, which is same in content but different format. So it's a pocket size book. So if I show you, and I'm trying to do something completely different from the existing economics books. As you can see from this table of contents, I mean, you will find a lot of things that you normally do not see in an introductory economics book. So the definition of economics, the history of capitalism, different schools of economics, topics like production and work, which do not get talked about very much. For example, in standard economics, we are mainly conceptualized as consumers. So we make consumer choice, firms provide the products and so on. And the firm is there, but it's seen as a black box. There's this thing called production function, which describes this relationship between some abstract quanta called capital and labor. And then there's really very little talk about how to actually organize production, whether sort of material things or immaterial things that are like what you produce here, and so on. So I try to talk about these things. I'll talk about some of them in a few minutes, but let's go through some of the basic things. My book also introduces the readers to what I call real life numbers. People think that economics is a number subject. And yes, I mean, indeed, if you look at economic articles, you see a lot of numbers. But these numbers are dealt in a very kind of abstract way, in aggregate way. So it is quite common these days that people graduate with an economics degree without knowing really much numbers about the real economy. So economics graduate that would be hard pressed to know what the national income of their country is, how big the world economy is, and what proportion of that is produced by the US or China or Germany. Now, at one level, why do you need to know these numbers? Because of you. You have created this amazing search engine where you can find anything. But even to know what to look for, you need some sense of these numbers. And if you have no sense of these numbers, you can make very serious misjudgment. A great recent example is the Eurozone crisis. So a number of European economies using the common currency euro got into economic trouble, and especially bad was the situation in Greece. And when the Greek crisis erupted, there's this very widely accepted narrative, mainly coming out of Germany, basically saying that Greeks are in trouble because they are lazy. Oh yeah, these Mediterranean types, they always eat and drink and dance, and they don't want to work, and they want to leech on the hardworking Germans and the Dutch and the Finns and so on. But actually, did you know that the Greeks work 30% longer than the Germans and 40% longer than the Dutch, who happen to be the laziest people in the world? They have the shortest working hour in the world. Once you know that, you realize that the Greek crisis is a crisis of productivity, not work ethic. Greeks actually work very hard. It's the overall Greek economy that has a low productivity, to address which we need to talk about investment in infrastructure, research and development, things like that. The Greek economic problem is not going to be solved by shouting at the Greeks that you have to work harder. Well, talking about that misunderstood numbers, in this country, Mexicans are seen as the quintessential lazy Latinos. But did you know that Mexicans actually work 25% longer than the Americans? This is just one example, but if you get these numbers wrong, you can have a pretty distorted sense of the real world economies. And for that reason, I emphasize that we need to know many of these real life numbers, and I actually keep a lot of them. Of course, emphasizing the importance of numbers doesn't mean that you have to take them too seriously. I suggest that numbers have to be taken with a pinch of salt and sometimes with a bag of salt. The German writer, and apparently he was also a scientist, writing books on the theory of color and things like that. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said everything factual is already a theory. Economic numbers, same with other numbers, but economic numbers are constructed on particular theoretical assumptions. So take the case of GDP, gross domestic product, which is a way of measuring what an economy produces in a given period. This the number doesn't include unpaid household work and care work that people do at home. Well, one standard justification is, they are not marketed. It's very difficult to calculate their economic value. But this is not true. In constructing the GDP data, the national statisticians go at the great length to impute, that's the technical term, impute the market value to services and goods that are not transacted in the market. So for example, if you own a house and live in there, they actually try to estimate the rent that you paid yourself if you're renting it from yourself. So when you are even trying to include those things, why do we not include household work and care work, which then leads to gross underestimation of the women's contribution to the economy, because most of this work is done by women. And in the standard estimate, this kind of ignored contribution is around estimated to be around 30% of national output in any country. Unemployed numbers. Well, if you want to be counted as unemployed, you should be willing to work. Not everyone who is not working is willing to work. One example is students. They want to get education, they do not want to work. So even if they are not working, they are not counted as unemployed. They are counted as the people who are not participating in the economy, not active in the labor market. There are people who might stay home but to take care of children, who are not seeking paid employment. So that you are counting only people who are willing to work, but then and do not have a job. But when you are counting the number of people who are unemployed, but how do you know whether this person is willing to work or not? You don't just ask them, are you willing to work? You have to prove that you are willing to work, which in standard methodology is done by showing that I have actually applied for a paid employment within the last 4 weeks. In normal times, this is not an unreasonable approach. But in difficult economic times, like we have been through in the last several years, there are a lot of people who are known as technically discouraged workers. Yeah, these are people who have applied for 100 jobs, 150 jobs, got rejected over and over and over again, and they just give up. So when the statisticians, the surveyors come and ask them, have you applied for a paid job in the last 4 weeks? They say no. But that doesn't mean that they are willingly unemployed. Anyway, you can debate all these numbers, but the point I'm trying to say here is that all these numbers are based on particular assumptions, and you can't take them in the way you take, I don't know, the temperature of water or weight of an elephant and so on. Although if you ask the scientists, they'll say even those numbers can be debated. Now, talking of science, many economists will try to tell you that economics is a science in which there's one right theory, or at least one best theory. But in this book, I devote one long chapter to explain that there are at least 9 different schools of economics, each with its own unique strengths and weaknesses. And for free market economics alone, there are 3 different varieties. One is classical economics of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, neoclassical, which is the dominant school of economics today, and Austrian. This is represented by the Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek. And this school is sometimes known as the libertarian in the United States. And the complication is that neoclassical economics isn't the same as the free market economics. Some neoclassical economists like Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz, they are not free market economists. We can talk about that if you are interested. But the majority of neoclassical economists these days advocate free market policy, but the way they advocate free market is all different. So the classical economists, they do not talk about individuals. They do not really talk about consumers. Because their analysis is based on class analysis. Their theory is that there are 3 classes, capitalists, workers, and landlords, and the best way to maximize national output is to give the maximum amount of surplus to the capitalists who will invest and generate growth and jobs. And in order to achieve that, the best way is to leave it to the market. Neoclassical economics doesn't have the notion of class. Actually, a lot of neoclassical economists will say, well, classes are wrong analytical categories. We are all individuals. There's no such supra-individual thing like class. The Austrians also have a very different defense of the free market. To simplify it, the neoclassical defense of free market is that everyone knows what he or she is doing, so leave people alone. The Austrian defense is no one really knows what's going on, so how dare the government thinks it can tell people what to do. These are quite different views of the world, because the Austrian view is that the world is full of uncertainty, our rationale is limited, and therefore there cannot be sort of some centrally planned, or at least a centrally directed policy. The neoclassical view is that the world is very certain, people are rational, they know what they are doing, so why should the government meddle with it? Yeah, so there are all these different ways of conceptualizing the economy, and if you know that there are 3 different ways of defending the free market, you know that this is another science like physics or chemistry. But I give you these different schools not to create division, not to create that factional fighting, because my view is that all these diverse approaches to economics is necessary in order to explain the complexity of real-world economies. And to illustrate this point, I give you what I call the Singapore problem, or life is stranger than fiction. If you read standard things about Singapore in, I don't know, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist magazine, standard economics textbooks, they'll only tell you about its free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. But you will never be told that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government, and 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, including Singapore Airlines. So I put it to my student, look, give me one economic theory. It doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, Austrian, Marxist, Keynesian, one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore. Well, they can't, because there's no such theory. Singapore combines the features of extreme free market capitalism and socialism. And where is the theory that can reconcile these two? So in the book, I argue that we should let 100 flowers bloom, as Chairman Mao Zedong once said. I mean, of course, he said it with ulterior motive. He wanted everyone to speak their mind and then get rid of people he didn't like. I don't have such intention. I don't have such power. So this is a genuine plea. But moreover, I argue that we should let them cross-fertilize, because different approaches to economics can actually benefit a lot from learning from each other, making our understanding of the economic world richer. And my advice to the reader is that they should try not to be a man or a woman with a hammer. There's this famous saying, sometimes attributed to Mark Twain, that he who has a hammer sees everything as a nail. Yeah, so if you acquire one theory, you keep applying it to everything. So if you acquire a hammer, you keep banging things. I mean, it's great that if it is a nail, it would just about work if it's a screw, but it will be a disaster if it is the egg. And it would be totally ineffectual if it's jelly. So we need a Swiss Army knife approach. We need a range of tools, and of course the sense with which to decide what tool to apply to what problem, which is provided by our knowledge of history, politics, and ethics, and so on. And this is what we need, because unfortunately, economists have become the proverbial man with a hammer. I mean, they have only one theory that they try to apply everywhere. We've seen what kind of mess it can create in the last several years. Now, as I said earlier, my book deals with a number of topics that are not usually discussed in economics books these days. So I mentioned production and work. Let me elaborate on only one of them, work. Most people of working age spend at least half their waking hours at work. And for white-collar workers like you and me, the boundary between work and personal life has been blurred because of the internet, the mobile phone, what have you. And if you begin to count the commuting hours, some people are spending basically 2/3 of their lives for work. In South Africa, under the apartheid regime, they built these so-called townships for black people, which are built in a far-flung place from the nice white cities, and the apartheid regime didn't really provide any public transport for these townships. Even after the end of the apartheid, the South African government haven't invested enough to solve this problem. So people in some of these townships have to rely on these strange things that are known as taxis in that country, which are basically minibuses run by organized crime gangs. So they charge an arm and a leg, and they have to travel in the very bad or sometimes non-existent road. For some people, one-way commute takes 3 hours. So it's 6 hours both ways, even if they work only 8 hours, which a few of these people do. You are spending 14 hours just going to work, working, coming back a day. Despite the fact that work takes up so much of our lives, there's really little discussion of work in economics books these days. I mean, work is, in a way, discussed only when it's absent, when there is unemployment. The work itself is not discussed. And this is because people are mainly conceptualized as consumers, as I mentioned earlier, in relation to production. Because in the standard economic theory, neoclassical economic theory, work is seen as this utility that people have to put up with so that they can earn some income with which to buy things, goods and services, whose consumption gives them utility, their ultimate pleasure in life. So work is only a means, but we know that what happens in a workplace tremendously affects us. Work can be interesting. I hope that at least that most people in this room think their work is interesting. Can be deathly boring. I mean, you've seen Charlie Chaplin in modern times. I mean, it can really affect your psychological well-being, because a lot of companies have introduced this performance monitoring regime, which really drive people hard, or they have reduced job security and so on. And ultimately, the work can also affect our identity and self-fulfillment. Despite that, we don't talk about work. So government policies and economic advices that economists give are all geared towards income. So a lot of people in the rich countries over the last 20 years have become richer, but many of them are feeling less happy because their work has become more stressful. The work intensity has increased, the commute has become longer, that there's less job security. But then these people are told that, oh, you should be happy. Your monetary income is 20% higher. But should they? Well, we need to discuss these things at least. Throughout the book, I emphasize that economics is a political subject. It's not a science. Of course, that many economists, neoclassical economists, will try to tell you that what they do is a value-free science. But economics cannot be separated from politics in the end. Actually, very interestingly, the early name for economics was political economy. There's a explicit recognition that politics and economics are inseparable. the neoclassical school, which came into being in the late 19th century, didn't like that. They wanted to make economic science. So they tried their best to get, their best to read economics or politics. So they renamed the subject from political economy to economics. They introduced this the ethical criteria, which they think is apolitical, known as the Pareto criterion. This is named after the half Italian, half French economist who taught in Switzerland in the late 19th and early 20th century, called Vilfredo Pareto. And Pareto argued that we should call a social change an improvement only when it makes at least some people better off, but makes no one worse off. And this actually is a very important principle, because it's a defense of individuals against the tyranny of the majority. Yeah, so to explain this, I don't do this in the book. I often use this story of that I call the one finger example. Suppose that someone knocks on my door tomorrow and says, "Oh, Dr. Chang, we've invented this wonderful technology that will solve the global climate change problem, but overnight. The machines are built, it's ready to go. We only need one tiny input, which we hope can provide." And I said, "What is it?" He says, "Well, we need one live human finger to start the machine." Yeah, I'll gladly walk into my kitchen, chop off my finger, and give it to him. But what if it's one arm? I think I'll do it. But what if it's my life? What if it's the life of all my family? What if it's the life of all 50 million Koreans? Where do you stop? So Pareto was terribly concerned about this and said, look, we can't say you have to sacrifice some people for the greater good. So this is a very important principle. However, it still is a political position, because the converse of this position is that you cannot make a social change that will improve the lives of many people if one person objects. So suppose there's a country with one very rich guy, and you try to introduce some welfare program for poor people. This guy can say no, and there's no way you can make this guy do it on the basis of the Pareto criterion. I'm not saying that this is easy. It's a terrible dilemma. What do you do? I mean, do you force that one person to give up a lot of things for the greater majority? Maybe you should, but then how about 10 people? How about 100 people? How about a whole group of people, and so on? So, it's a terribly difficult issue, but what I'm trying to say is that you cannot read economics or politics. Actually, the political nature of economics goes even deeper. In my earlier book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, I have this chapter, the first chapter, titled "There's No Such Thing as a Free Market." The point I try to make there is that there is no objective scientific way to draw the boundary around the market. Yeah, so 200 years ago, in this country and lots of other countries, it was perfectly normal to buy and sell people. Child labor was considered normal. Today, I haven't met any free market economists who say that we need to bring back child labor to truly make our economy a free market economy. Well, there's one person who almost said that, although he's not an economist, Newt Gingrich. Yes. You know the story. He said poor children should work as janitors in their school. But other than him, I haven't met any advocate of free market who want to bring back child labor. But in the 19th century, when the social reformers wanted to regulate child labor, many free market economists are up in arms. They said that this is undermining the very foundation of a free market economy, namely the freedom of contract. These children want to work, these people want to employ them. What is your problem? It's not like these people kidnap these children and use them as slave laborers. Yeah, so if you take that ethical position, there's nothing wrong with child labor. But a lot of people have come to accept that no, actually children need childhood, they have the right to education, and they need protection up to a certain age. Once you accept that, it is inconceivable that we are debating whether to relax regulation on child labor so that we can become an even more free market economy. So economics is a fundamentally political subject. Don't let any economist to tell you that it's a science. Well, finally, my book is not just an explanation of economic theories and facts. It's also about the role of economics in public life. And in this regard, I have 3 sets of observations to make. So the first one is never trust an economist, and that includes me. Yeah, of course, this creates the kind of paradox that the Greek philosophers used to love. So if you don't trust any economist, how do you trust this guy who says don't trust any economist? I'm not a philosopher. I'm not going to bother with that. This is my advice. Professional economists do not have a monopoly over truth, and it is entirely possible for people who are not professional economists to have sound judgments on economic issues. And sometimes judgments might even be better because they may be more rooted in reality and less narrowly focused. Indeed, I would argue that the willingness on the part of ordinary citizens to challenge professional economists and other experts is a foundation of democracy. Just think about it. If all you have to do is to entrust it to the professionals, what's the point of having democracy? Yeah, let economists that run economic policy. Let the international relations scholars run foreign policy. Let philosophers run, I don't know, your policies on religion and marriage. Yeah, and the rest of the population don't need to bother. Well, some people think that, but I think that's a terrible idea because then there's no point in having democracy. I also argue that, well, I'm not even trying to pretend that I can read Latin. I mean, apparently there's a passage written on the walls of the city halls of Gouda, the town famous for its cheese. I don't know how they invented this thing in the middle of all the cheese making, but they did. And I think this is the thing we have to bear in mind when you're having this debate about economic issues, which are, inevitably involve political and ethical judgments. And I'm not saying that we should not have a strong opinion of our own. I mean, we should, But given the complexity of the world and given the necessarily partial nature of all economic theories, we should be humble about the validity of our favorite theory and should keep an open mind about it. And finally, throughout the book, even while I constantly make reform proposals, I emphasize how difficult it is to change the economic reality. Sometimes the difficulty is due to the active attempts by those who benefit from the current arrangements who want to defend their positions. Bribing, lobbying, media propaganda, and even violence are used. But the status quo often gets defended even without some people actively being evil. You don't need Dr. Evil to have the world that is evil. Because the $1, one vote rule of the market drastically constrains the ability of those with less money to refuse undesirable options given to them. So poor workers choose to work in a dangerous factory. But is that a real choice? Yes, I mean, at one level, it is a choice because the alternative is starvation. But if you had a different social arrangements, these people would not choose that kind of thing. Yeah, so in this regard, I'm always reminded of this famous saying by this Brazilian bishop called Dom Helder Camara, who was one of the leaders of the liberation theology, which is the radical left-wing Catholic theology that was quite popular in Latin America in the 1950s and 60s. And Camara said, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why these poor people do not have enough to eat, they call me a communist. Yeah, and in that sense, we should all become a bit of a communist. You should question the social order, the economic order underlying the surface phenomenon, and try to question whether this order is just, or efficient, or whatever, and whether it can be changed. Moreover, we can be susceptible to beliefs that go against our own interests. The Marxists used to call this false consciousness. Today we call it the matrix. The best example came from this country when they tried to introduce so-called Obamacare. There were pictures of these pensioners demonstrating against Obamacare with placards saying, "Government hands off my Medicare program." Hello, Medicare is a government program. But these people have been so brainwashed by the medical insurance lobby that they think it's a private program because it works. Because they've been told all the time that government program never works. So we have a lot of difficulties in changing the social order because of the active obstruction of people who benefit from the status quo, the limitations of choices that markets give to poor people, and down to false consciousness. But acknowledging the difficulties should not make us give up the fight to create a better economy and in the end, a better society. Yes, changes are difficult, but in the long run, when enough people fight for them, many impossible things happen. Yes, I mean, 200 years ago, anyone who in this country that said we should abolish slavery would have been branded unrealistic at best. Yeah, and makes sense. I mean, the U.S. economy at the time was totally dependent on the export of cotton, tobacco, and other agricultural products produced by southern plantations that use slaves. So saying that we should free all these slaves was undermine, that can be easily seen as an attempt to undermine the foundation of the U.S. economy. 100 years ago in Britain and other countries, they put women in jail for asking for vote. Only 50, 60 years ago, all the founding fathers of most of today's developing nations, well, actually including Israel, were hunted down by the British and the French as terrorists. And 25 years ago, not that long ago, Margaret Thatcher famously said that anyone who thinks that there will be a black majority rule in South Africa is living in a cloud cuckoo land, which is where she was living. Yeah, so all these impossible things have happened because people fought for them. And this is why I often quote Antonio Gramsci, the Italian political thinker, that we need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. And let me conclude by showing you my favorite quote from Nelson Mandela, who said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." Thank you very much. Right, I'll be happy to take any question and comment you may have.
I have one question. So
Yeah.
a lot of us are involved in technology that it seems to me simplistically is driving up productivity. And it seems if just, the normal progression of things just from a mathematical perspective might be the case that the needed employment to supply goods and services, there's no particular, I don't see any guarantee that it needs to stay high, that in fact we could have fewer and fewer people, like in agriculture or something else.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, is that something that, in modern free market economics, people are looking at, that assumption? It seems as if we always regard lower employment as something that needs to get fixed, and clearly with just the right policies, we can fix it. What's the proof that says that there is gainful employment within a free market
Right.
structure?
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that, the interesting question. Yes, in the long run, we have always found work for the majority of people.
Right, but until, as you say, until 50 years ago, most people didn't have enough food. There were basic needs that weren't met.
No, let me, continue, yeah. So, not so long ago, even in the fairly rich countries, 15, 20% of people worked in agriculture. Today it's 1 or 2%. Yeah? In South Korea, my native country, when I was born in the early 1960s, nearly 80% of people worked in agriculture. Today it's like 3%. Yeah, so if you believe that these people who say technological progress destroys jobs, I mean, we would have had that terrible employment crisis over the last 200 years. So in the long run, we keep finding new things to make, new services to provide, and people have jobs. The trouble is in the transition period, when the change is very fast. When a lot of people lose jobs, they need to get retooled, if you like, and that takes time. That takes the income support and so on. And some countries have managed this better than others through various government assisted retraining schemes and so on. So yes, I mean technology will destroy many jobs, but it will also create many. But then during the transition period, you need some kind of social arrangement to help people to retool themselves to find new jobs. Some countries do it better than others. Yes?
But the jobs that are replaced are not necessarily equivalent to the jobs that are lost, right? There's a lot of evidence that the sort of tranche of jobs in the middle is being taken out by automation. Only the jobs that are too cheap to automate or too expensive to automate.
Yeah.
Right? And annihilating some large fraction of middle class jobs.
Yes, I mean this is in a way the new phenomenon, because in the past the jobs that have been destroyed were mainly to do with manual labor. So the so-called low-class jobs now is encroaching the middle class area, and this is probably why we see more anxious comments in the media, because those are people who are writing for the media, who give opinions to the media. But once again, the jobs can be created through the different social arrangements. For example, in many European countries, a very large number of people work in public welfare services. And yes, they were created deliberately by government intervention, and I don't see anything wrong with that. So yes, I mean basically my view is that the technology and other economic forces are difficult to control, but they are not like earthquake. They are not like typhoon. I mean there are different ways of dealing with them. And for example, a lot of people have argued that because of globalization, inequalities are rising everywhere. This is not true. It hasn't risen in Switzerland. Also, if you look at the data before taxation and welfare transfer, many European countries actually are as unequal as the United States. Sweden, Belgium, Germany, they are very unequal before those things. And they tax and redistribute so much, their income inequality after those things is much lower than in the US. So you can change those things. This is not to say that those countries were not affected by globalization and technological change and so on, but there's actually a lot more that you can do than people suggest. So please don't think that, I mean, it's all because of technology or whatever, middle class jobs will have to disappear. No, they don't have to. Yes.
I'm just wondering, to me, it seems like there's also some similarity in some of the philosophical changes associated with how you look at work, even with the fights we had in this country, going from, say, the 10-hour workday to the 8-hour workday, where at first was, union fights, whatever, to do that, and companies saying, well, we're going to cut your pay if we cut your hours, and strikes saying, no, we want the same pay for reduced hours, and where the money was coming from, and just the change in who's driving what. The scale might be a little bit different, but it just seems that just the underlying assumptions of we earn our food, whatever, from work, these jobs exist, if they go away, who suffers, and just the underlying assumptions almost seem to be what needs to change, just sort of like they changed in those times.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have this beautiful example in the chapter on work in this book. In 1905, the New York State introduced this law restricting the working hours of bakery workers to like 10 hours. Typically, bakers work 14 hours in those days, some of them 16. So the New York State thought that this is outrageous, wanted to regulate it. The Supreme Court struck it out as unconstitutional. They said this deprives the workers the freedom to work as long as they want. Yes, so there was a time when even 16-hour work was considered okay, and yes, people have fought for it and got these rights, and I mean it's exactly where politics comes in, because of course, I mean there were also economic forces. People are relatively speaking becoming more valuable. Than when the country was poorer, so there was also economic forces, but economic forces only give you the outer boundary. Exactly where you end up within that boundary depends on your political action, union activities, or the democratic pressure and things like that. Yes.
So I think in response to the productivity question, there's always stuff for people to do. The issue is whether society, or how much society values that be done. When I was in Hong Kong 20 years ago, there were people whose job it was to go down the street every morning with a broom and a basket, sweeping everything up from the night before.
That's right. Yeah.
During the Depression, the WPA, the New Deal, created jobs by saying, we need infrastructure in our national parks. We need a bathhouse on Revere Beach, right? And it's a question of whether you have, to what extent the work is valued, rather than whether the work is available.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. These economic values of jobs are, in large part created by the society. So if you, begin to hire a lot of, say, nursery nurses to to enable women to leave their children and go out to work, that creates a certain dynamic. But if the government isn't willing to fund that kind of thing, only rich women will be able to afford those things. So the value of women's work itself is dependent on the political action of the governments. And that's another example, but yes, you're absolutely right. What is valuable work is partly socially determined. Yes?
So inequality is increasing, and I think my understanding is that mobility is decreasing. Is there any way, in the United States at least, is there any way that could be reversed without significant policy changes, or is that something that will sort of, in theory,
it is a general phenomenon. With increasing inequality, mobility falls. It's a well-known regularity. Now, I think what we have to think about here is, the people who say, well, inequality should be accepted, usually tend to focus on equality of opportunity. Yeah, so as far as you had the same opportunity, you shouldn't complain, because that more competent people will rise to the top and less competent people will fall to the bottom. This will be correct if you lived in Aldous Huxley's The Brave New World and everyone was raised on the same condition, but they are not. Yeah? So if you have richer parents, you get more attention, you get better education, you get better nutrition, and so on. So, it's like a race where, no one is allowed to have a head start. It's the equality of opportunity, but you don't mention that some kids have only one leg. So is it a fair race? So we need to think about this the generational transmission of inequality. And yes, I'm afraid unless you equalize not necessarily the parental income, but the life opportunities that children have when they are young, we are not going to solve this problem. And there's a lot of research showing how social mobility in, for example, Scandinavian countries much higher than in countries like Britain and the United States, because they provide those conditions when children are young, whereas in the U.S. and Britain they don't do that to the same extent. So yes, we need that policy intervention. It will need some reduction in income inequality, but you should have more focused intervention in terms of the childhood stimulus and nutrition and opportunities. Yes, please.
I'm significantly shorter than the person who was here before me. In the beginning, you kind of mentioned that we as people have opinions on all kinds of topics that we're probably not qualified for, and I think part of that's because various forces have kind of allowed us to mobilize around one element of it, right? So if you think about global warming or issues of environmentalism, we focus on global warming, not like the 12 other issues that are part of this broader need to fix what's happening environmentally. So what would you say are there one or two economic issues that we as lay people, or me as someone who has a liberal arts background, could maybe mobilize around to invoke more conversation?
Well, this will depend on the exact society we are talking about, because this mobilization, have to address the questions that are the most important for that particular society, and also different people kind of react to the same thing differently. So it is well known that in this country, typically the tolerance for inequality is a lot higher than, say, in European countries, which doesn't necessarily mean that inequality shouldn't be an issue here, but you need to consider these things. And yes, you're absolutely right. What people find difficult to in their attempt to be active, responsible citizen is that there are so many issues. I sometimes joke that the most difficult job in the world is to be a responsible citizen of a democratic country, because you have to care about everything, from global warming to your country's income inequality, balance of payments, monetary policy, the defense policy, what have you. So yes, if you tell people, well, we have like 727 issues, let's all think about it, they'll not do it. So you need to focus, but exactly what are those one or two issues will depend on the time and the country. And yes, I think in the U.S., the concern for inequalities actually become very strong. I wouldn't have imagined it to be so even say 10 years ago. But yes, this might be your chance to address some of this inequality problem, even though the final outcome might be you are still more unequal than, say, Sweden. So yes, you'll have to think about those things and try to focus people's mind, because as my intellectual hero Herbert Simon once said, the most scarce resource in human society is attention. Yes, please.
What will happen to UK on Friday if Scotland splits apart?
Yeah, well, I am not a UK citizen, so I don't have to worry about that. I only have, well, the UK equivalent of green card. Yes, but I think this is quite a complicated issue because, you know, if you read about the history of the United Kingdom in the last 3 centuries, actually the Scots were crucial in building the UK economy. You know, all the early economists, Adam Smith, well, except for David Ricardo, who was a Jew, was Scots. Yeah? The guy who set up the Bank of England was a Scotsman called Patterson. Yeah? I mean, the way that these two countries worked together was quite amazing. And yeah, now the Scots are saying, you know, we want to leave. I think the one difficulty here is that the Scots, many Scots see it as a way to get rid of the Conservative Party rather than truly be a separate country. So yeah, they might be in for a shock because, you know, my view is why not, you know? Yeah, there are a lot of small, very prosperous countries, you know. Finland has less than 5 million people. You know, Denmark has 5 million people. Austria has 7 million, Switzerland has 7 million, so why not? But you know, this will create quite a disruption in the short run, and yes, the UK economy might suffer because of all this short-term turmoil. And can it survive that given its weakened state? I don't know. I mean, because the UK economy was damaged a lot more by this 2008 financial crisis than even the United States, because its reliance on finance was much higher. And yeah, I shudder to think what will happen, but it's not for me to say. Any more? Well, thank you very much for listening.